This is absolutely unbelievable. Seth freaking Rollins just shocked the entire wrestling world by doing the one thing nobody thought was possible. He reunited with Roman Reigns and rejoined the man he once betrayed with a steel chair, the man he spent the last decade feuding with on and off, the man who represents everything Seth claimed to hate about WWE's power structure. And what makes this alliance absolutely mind-blowing is that it came after the most devastating betrayal Seth has ever experienced, a backstage attack so brutal and so calculated that it broke something fundamental in Seth's psyche and made him realize that the only way to survive in WWE's cutthroat environment is to align with the most dangerous man in the company. I need you to drop a comment immediately if you think Seth Rollins just sold his soul by joining Roman Reigns, because this isn't just a simple alliance, this is Seth admitting that everything he stood for over the past decade was wrong, that his vision of being WWE's architect and leader was a delusion, and that the only path to success is submitting to the tribal chief's authority and becoming just another soldier in Roman's empire. The man who destroyed the Shield is now crawling back to Roman Reigns, and the implications of this reunion are going to reshape the entire WWE landscape in ways we can't even imagine yet. But before I break down every shocking detail of how this reunion happened, before I reveal the brutal betrayal that drove Seth to this desperate decision, and before I expose the real reason why Roman Reigns was willing to accept Seth back into his circle despite their toxic history, you need to smash that like button if you believe Seth Rollins has just made the biggest mistake of his career by aligning with Roman Reigns. Because what I'm about to tell you about the backstage manipulation, the psychological warfare, and the power dynamics that led to this moment is going to make you question everything you thought you knew about the Shield's legacy in WWE's current era. Let me take you through exactly what happened on Raw that led to this earth-shattering reunion, because the context is crucial to understanding why Seth made this choice. The show opened with Seth Rollins in the ring, clearly emotional and vulnerable in a way we rarely see from him. Seth had visible bruises and injuries from the savage attack he suffered the previous week at the hands of former allies who turned on him in the most brutal fashion. Seth grabbed a microphone and started cutting a promo that was raw and honest in a way that broke through typical wrestling rhetoric. Seth talked about how he spent his entire career trying to prove that he's the best, that he can succeed on his own terms without needing anyone. Seth admitted that his betrayal of the Shield in 2014 wasn't just about personal ambition, it was about his insecurity, his fear that he would always be seen as just another member rather than the guy. Seth revealed that for the past decade, he's been haunted by that decision. Every alliance he's formed since then has been tainted by the knowledge that he's capable of betrayal. Every friend he's made has looked at him with suspicion. Every tag team partner has wondered when Seth would turn on them the way he turned on Roman and Dean. Seth said, "I've been carrying the weight of that chair shot for 10 years, and it's made me paranoid, it's made me isolated, and it's made me vulnerable." The crowd was silent, completely absorbed in Seth's emotional confession. But then Seth's tone changed from vulnerable to angry. Seth said, "But you know what I've learned? I learned that everyone in this business is capable of betrayal. I learned that loyalty is a lie we tell ourselves. I learned that the only thing that matters is power, and if you don't have it, you're just a target waiting to be destroyed." Seth then dropped the bombshell that would change everything. "For years, I fought against Roman Reigns because I couldn't accept that he was right about how this business works. Roman understood that you need family, you need strength, you need people who will stand with you not out of friendship but out of shared interest. And after what happened to me last week, after I was betrayed by people I trusted, I finally understand what Roman has been saying all along." The crowd started buzzing with anticipation and confusion. Was Seth about to do what it seemed like he was about to do? Seth continued, "So Roman, I know you're back there. I know we have history. I know I'm the last person you'd ever want to work with. But I'm standing here, in front of the world, asking you to let me join the bloodline. Not as an equal, not as a leader, but as someone who finally gets it. Someone who understands that your way is the only way." The arena erupted in shock and disbelief. Fans were screaming their reactions, some in excitement, some in horror, some in confusion. The announcers were speechless, trying to process what they just heard. And then Roman Reigns' music hit, and the tribal chief made his entrance with that signature confidence and authority that has defined his reign. Roman walked to the ring slowly, deliberately, making Seth wait and making the audience wait with him. When Roman finally entered the ring, he stood face to face with Seth, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. These two men have so much history, brothers who became enemies, enemies who occasionally became allies, a relationship defined by betrayal and competition and unresolved conflict. Roman took the microphone and the first thing he said was, "Seth, we both know you're full of it." The crowd roared at Roman's bluntness. Roman continued, "You're not here because you finally understand, you're here because you're desperate. You got your ass kicked, you realized you can't survive alone, and now you're looking for protection. That's not respect, that's weakness." Seth looked furious but also couldn't deny Roman's words. Roman went on, "But you know what? I don't care why you're here. I care about what you can do. The Shield was the most dominant force in WWE history because we had you as our architect. You're a master strategist, you're one of the best in-ring workers this company has ever seen, and despite being a snake, you're useful." Roman's acceptance was cold and calculating rather than warm or brotherly. Roman made it clear that this wasn't about forgiveness or rebuilding their friendship, this was a business arrangement. Roman said, "You want in the bloodline? Fine. But understand this, you're not my brother, you're my employee. You do what I tell you, when I tell you, and if you ever cross me or question my authority, what happened to you last week will look like a massage compared to what I'll do to you." The terms were brutal and humiliating, but Seth accepted. Seth extended his hand, and after a long, tense pause, Roman shook it. The handshake wasn't warm or friendly, it was a transaction, a contract signed in front of millions. And just like that, Seth Rollins became part of Roman Reigns' bloodline. But the reunion wasn't complete yet. The original members of the bloodline, GUSO and Jimmy USO, came out next, and their reactions were fascinating. G in particular looked conflicted. G has been through his own journey with Roman, experiencing abuse and manipulation before eventually reconciling. Seeing Seth join the bloodline brought back all those complicated emotions for G. Jimmy seemed more accepting but still cautious. The Usos surrounded Seth in the ring, and there was this moment where it felt like they might attack Seth rather than welcome him. But Roman raised his hand, and the Usos backed off. Roman's control over his family was absolute, and if Roman said Seth was in, then Seth was in regardless of how anyone else felt. The segment ended with all four men standing in the ring, Roman in the center with Seth and the Usos flanking him. It was a visual that nobody thought they'd ever see. The architect who destroyed the Shield was now part of Roman's empire, and the implications were staggering. Now let me tell you about the brutal betrayal that drove Seth to this decision, because understanding what happened to Seth explains why he was willing to swallow his pride and join Roman. The previous week on Raw, Seth had been working with a group of allies against a common enemy. Seth trusted these people, believed they shared his values and his vision for WWE's future. But in a backstage segment, these supposed allies turned on Seth in the most vicious way possible. They jumped him from behind, beating him down with weapons, targeting his previously injured body parts, and leaving him broken and bloodied on the concrete floor. The attack was so brutal that Seth had to be taken to a hospital, and the attackers stood over his unconscious body laughing and celebrating. What made this betrayal particularly devastating for Seth was that he saw it coming but chose to ignore the warning signs. There had been tension building within the group, small moments where Seth's allies seemed less committed or questioned his leadership. But Seth's ego and his desperate need to prove he could lead people successfully made him blind to the obvious signs of impending betrayal. The attack shattered Seth's confidence and his worldview. Seth had spent years believing that he could build alliances based on mutual respect and shared goals. The betrayal proved that his approach was naive and that trusting anyone in WWE is a mistake. Seth realized that the only relationships that survive in WWE are those built on power and fear rather than friendship and loyalty. This realization is what drove Seth to Roman. Seth recognized that Roman's approach, building a family structure based on authority and dominance rather than equality, is actually more stable than what Seth had been trying to do. Roman's family members might not always like him, but they respect his power and understand that their success is tied to his success. That creates loyalty through pragmatism rather than emotion. Let's talk about Roman's motivations for accepting Seth, because this is fascinating from a character perspective. Roman doesn't need Seth from a power standpoint. Roman is already dominant, already has a strong faction, already controls WWE's landscape. So why would Roman take the risk of bringing in someone with Seth's history of betrayal? The answer is strategic calculation. Roman recognizes that Seth brings skills and assets that the current bloodline lacks. Seth is a master manipulator who can work psychological warfare on opponents. Seth is one of the best in-ring performers who can be relied on to deliver in big matches. Seth has connections and knowledge about other wrestlers' weaknesses that Roman can exploit. But there's also an ego element to Roman's decision. Having Seth Rollins, the man who betrayed the Shield, the man who once positioned himself as Roman's equal or superior, submit to Roman's authority and join his empire is the ultimate validation of Roman's worldview. It proves that Roman was right all along, that his way of doing things is superior, and that eventually everyone comes around to acknowledging Roman as the tribal chief. Roman is also using Seth to send a message to the rest of the WWE roster. If even Seth Rollins, proud, arrogant, independent Seth Rollins, can be brought to heel and made to acknowledge Roman, then nobody is beyond Roman's reach. It's psychological warfare on a massive scale, designed to make every other wrestler wonder if they'll eventually end up in the same position. Now let's discuss the reactions from other WWE superstars, because the locker room is divided and shocked by this development. Some wrestlers view Seth's decision as pragmatic and smart. These wrestlers argue that in WWE's current environment, aligning with Roman is the best way to ensure success and protection. They see Seth as making a mature, calculated decision to prioritize his career over his ego. But other wrestlers view Seth as a sellout and a coward. These wrestlers argue that Seth spent years positioning himself as an alternative to Roman's dominance, and now he's just giving up and joining the very thing he claimed to oppose. They see this as Seth admitting defeat and abandoning any claim to being a leader or revolutionary. Cody Rhodes reportedly had a particularly strong reaction to Seth's decision. Cody and Seth have had a complicated relationship, and seeing Seth join Roman, the man Cody has been feuding with and trying to dethrone, feels like a personal betrayal. Cody apparently views this as Seth choosing the easy path rather than continuing to fight for what's right. Kevin Owens is another wrestler who's reportedly disgusted by Seth's choice. KO has been Seth's friend through various ups and downs, and he feels betrayed by Seth joining Roman's faction. KO apparently told people backstage that he's done with Seth and that their friendship can't survive this decision. The USO's feelings are particularly complex. GUSO understands better than anyone what it's like to be under Roman's control, to feel manipulated and used. G sees Seth going through the same thing he went through, and part of him wants to warn Seth about what he's getting into. But G also recognizes that he can't interfere without going against Roman, and he's not willing to risk another family civil war. Jimmy USO is more accepting of Seth's presence because Jimmy tends to be more pragmatic about family and bloodline politics. Jimmy recognizes that Seth makes the bloodline stronger, and that's ultimately good for everyone involved. But Jimmy is also watchful, keeping an eye on Seth for any signs of betrayal because he knows Seth's history. Let me reveal some shocking backstage information about how this reunion was negotiated, because according to sources, there were extensive discussions between Seth and Roman before this happened on television. Seth apparently reached out to Roman privately shortly after his betrayal, asking for a meeting. Roman initially refused, viewing Seth's request as a sign of weakness and not wanting to appear too eager to help. But Paul Heyman, Roman's wise man and advisor, apparently convinced Roman to at least hear Seth out. Heyman argued that Seth's skills and experience would be valuable assets, and that having Seth under Roman's control would be better than having Seth as an unpredictable wildcard. Heyman also suggested that bringing Seth into the fold would humiliate Seth in a way that served Roman's interests. The actual meeting between Seth and Roman was reportedly intense and uncomfortable. Seth had to essentially grovel and admit that Roman was right about everything. Seth had to acknowledge that his betrayal of the Shield was the biggest mistake of his career. Seth had to pledge loyalty to Roman in terms that were clearly demeaning and one-sided. Roman apparently enjoyed making Seth squirm, asking pointed questions about Seth's past betrayals and making Seth explain why this time would be different. Roman made Seth prove his commitment by demanding that Seth burn bridges with other wrestlers and publicly declare his allegiance. The power dynamic was completely tilted in Roman's favor, and Seth had no choice but to accept every humiliating term. Now let's talk about what this means for WWE's storyline landscape going forward, because Seth joining Roman creates massive implications for multiple feuds and angles. The most obvious impact is on the Bloodline's power level. They were already dominant, but adding Seth's skills makes them potentially unstoppable. Who can possibly stand against Roman, the Usos, and Seth Rollins all working together? This forces WWE's babyfaces to unite in ways they haven't before. We might see unlikely alliances formed specifically to combat the enhanced Bloodline. Wrestlers who normally compete with each other might have to set aside their differences and work together. This could lead to some fascinating matchups and storylines. There's also the question of how long this alliance lasts. Seth's history suggests that he's incapable of staying loyal to anyone for extended periods. Will Seth eventually betray Roman the same way he's betrayed everyone else? Or has Seth genuinely changed and committed to this path? The audience will be watching for signs of discord, creating natural tension even when Seth is supposedly loyal. The Shield's legacy is also being fundamentally rewritten by this development. The Shield ended because of Seth's betrayal, but now 2/3 of the Shield are working together again under very different circumstances. This raises questions about whether the Shield as a concept can ever truly be finished, whether these three men are destined to be connected regardless of their individual journeys. There's speculation that this could be building toward an eventual Shield reunion that includes Dean Ambrose/Jon Moxley returning to WWE. Imagine Seth and Roman slowly rebuilding trust, then Dean comes back to complete the trio. The pop would be enormous, and the storytelling potential would be incredible. But that's speculation at this point. Let me share some information about fan reactions, because social media has been in absolute chaos since this angle aired. Wrestling Twitter exploded with passionate reactions on all sides. The hashtags #SethRollins, #Roman Reigns, #Bloodline, and #The Shield all trend worldwide for hours after the show. One segment of fans is thrilled by this development. They view it as a natural evolution of both characters and are excited to see Seth and Roman working together again. These fans are creating fantasy booking scenarios about matches and feuds the enhanced Bloodline could have. They're celebrating WWE for doing something unexpected and bold. Another segment is angry and feels betrayed by this storyline. They invested in Seth as a character who stood for something different than Roman's authoritarian approach. Seeing Seth submit to Roman feels like a betrayal of everything Seth's character has claimed to represent. These fans feel like WWE is prioritizing shock value over character consistency. A third segment is skeptical about whether this makes sense from a character perspective. They're questioning whether Seth would really make this choice, whether Roman would really accept Seth, and whether the history between these two men can be overcome this easily. These fans want to see more explanation and development before fully buying into this alliance. The reactions reveal how invested fans are in these characters and their histories. This isn't a throwaway angle, people care deeply about the Shield's legacy and about what this reunion means for WWE storytelling. That emotional investment is exactly what makes this angle so powerful and controversial. Now let's discuss the long-term implications for Seth's character arc, because this decision fundamentally changes his trajectory. Seth has been defined for years by his independence, his refusal to submit to anyone's authority, his belief that he knows best. Joining Roman destroys all of that and forces Seth to become something he's never been, a follower rather than a leader. This creates fascinating character work opportunities. How does Seth handle no longer being in control? How does he deal with Roman making decisions he disagrees with? How does he maintain his identity and self-respect while acknowledging someone else as superior? These are deep psychological questions that could lead to compelling television if WWE commits to exploring them. There's also the possibility of Seth learning from Roman and eventually surpassing him. Maybe Seth's time in the bloodline is actually an apprenticeship where Seth studies Roman's methods, understands what makes Roman successful, and then eventually uses that knowledge to overthrow Roman and take control himself. That would be a long-term story that pays off years down the line. Make sure you're subscribed to WrestlingNewsCC with all notifications on, because this story is going to dominate WWE programming for months to come. Seth Rollins joining Roman Reigns is the biggest storyline development of 2025, and you need comprehensive coverage from someone who's going to give you all the angles, all the backstage details, and all the analysis. Drop a comment right now with your honest reaction. Do you love or hate Seth joining Roman? Do you think this makes sense for both characters? How long do you think this alliance will last? Who do you want to see stand against the enhanced bloodline? Is this leading to an eventual Shield reunion? I want to hear your thoughts on this unprecedented development. Smash that like button if you think Seth Rollins just made the most controversial decision of his career. Share this video with everyone who needs to understand the full context of why this happened and what it means for WWE's future. This is Wrestling News CC, bringing you in-depth analysis of the biggest wrestling story of the year. Seth Rollins has joined Roman Reigns, the bloodline is more powerful than ever, and the entire WWE landscape has been transformed. Whether this leads to incredible storytelling or whether it's a decision WWE will regret remains to be seen. But one thing is absolutely certain: professional wrestling will never be the same after Seth Rollins bent the knee to the tribal chief.